Perhaps you've noticed something anomalous on your first paycheck of the year. The amount was a bit different than you'd expected, but you didn't think much of it. You should have. Someplace in that first paycheck was embedded a decision about your money, not your own, but a rule that went into effect on January 1st. And if you're over 50, that rule may have just cost you thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. There's nothing wrong with the rule itself. It's more surprising than anything to find a rule that big embedded in a paycheck that went unnoticed, but its consequences reach far deeper than mere money. This is a story about default options and about the invisible choices we're forced to make in our names, often without knowing it. It's a story about retirement accounts and the psychology of why we save or fail to save the way we do. Every year, the IRS quietly lowers or raises the limit for how much money you contribute to a 401k plan. This year, the number was $24,500. If you're over 50, however, you get to make an additional contribution called a catch-up contribution of $8,000. Sounds generous, right? Well, there is a catch, one which few people know about, buried deep inside a law called Secure 2.0, passed years ago and only now taking effect. If you earned more than $150,000 this year, your catch-up contributions for this year are no longer allowed to be made with pre-tax dollars. They must be made with after-tax dollars. Why does that matter? Well, traditionally, it's been considered a virtue to defer taxes on income as much as possible, preferably until you're in a lower tax bracket than you're in currently. That's basically the entire philosophy of the traditional tax-deferred 401k plan. When you put money into a traditional 401k, you're reducing your taxable income for the year, thus paying less income tax. That money is then allowed to grow, tax-deferred, until you retire, and you can begin withdrawing it then, ideally in a lower tax bracket than you're in currently. It's a kind of psychological trick to get you to save more money than you would otherwise. When you put money into your 401k, you feel richer, since your taxable income is lower, while you have to wait to pay taxes on that money until later. Economists like Richard Thaler have studied the psychology of deferred taxation and how it encourages people to save more money for the future. The traditional 401k plan is in a sense an economic exploitation of human psychology. You take the money you would have spent in the present, and you trade it for a bigger amount of money in the future, which is why the new rules are so concerning. If you're a high earner and you make catch-up contributions, you no longer get the option to defer taxation on them. You pay taxes on that income in the present, in the highest tax bracket you'll likely ever be in, while the money you're contributing will likely sit in your retirement account, untaxed, for the rest of your life now. Most people are never going to notice a provision like this, buried in a law like this, passed years ago, and only now taking effect, are they? Most people who make catch-up contributions to their 401k accounts are going to continue doing so in pretty much the same way they always have, which means it's entirely possible for an employer plan to quietly reroute those catch-up contributions to a Roth 401k, thereby taxing them in the present without anyone even realizing it. Either that, or, if the plan administrator doesn't know what to do, the contributions get rejected altogether as taxable income for this year, since the plan administrator didn't realize the change in the law and incorrectly tried to withhold taxes on them. Either way, you're getting taxed on that income this year when you're in the highest tax bracket you'll ever be in. It's this latter scenario, the one where most people are entirely unaware that the rules have changed, that's the most worrying. Financial planners are estimating that if you're a high earner making maximum catch-up contributions, you're looking at a potential tax shock this year of around $3,500 if the catch-up contributions were rerouted to a Roth 401k. Or, if the contributions were simply rejected, you're looking at a much larger tax liability this year, since you didn't realize you were going to be taxed on that income this year, meaning that you may not have planned your personal finances around that additional income. Most people, when they get their first paycheck of the year, are entirely unaware that their retirement money has quietly disappeared and quietly reappeared as taxable income. It's hard to understand how something as massive as this goes unnoticed by nearly everyone, but it really is the case. The way we're encouraged to deal with taxes in day-to-day life is to pretend they don't exist, to ignore them as much as possible. Taxes are a taboo topic in polite conversation, and they tend to get swept under the rug in nearly every discussion of personal finance, despite being one of the largest expenses anyone can have, and certainly the most difficult to control. In economics, deferred taxation can act, for all intents and purposes, as a kind of imaginary number. When someone puts money into a traditional 401k account, they can tell themselves, that money isn't really mine, when in reality it is, in a very real sense. By putting the money into a tax-deferred account, you get to spend it now, and pay taxes on it later when you may be in a lower tax bracket. It's the same principle of taking a loan out against your future self's income to fund your present spending, and it's one that works particularly well with the human psyche. People are much happier spending money they know they have, rather than money they're saving for later. It's the entire economic underpinning of the traditional 401k plan. By taking that money out of your paycheck, you make yourself feel richer, without having to spend as much money in the present. It's a kind of trick designed to encourage you to save more money than you otherwise would. That's why the new rules are so worrying. If you're a high earner, you no longer get to defer that taxation on your catch-up contributions the way you always have. You pay a much higher effective tax rate on that income this year, in the highest tax bracket you're ever going to be in, while the money you contributed will sit in your retirement account for the rest of your life, untaxed. It's a much more punishing system for you as a higher earner, and you probably didn't even realize it's happening. It's a strange and unfair way to penalize people who make a lot of money, isn't it? Perhaps it's not so strange to you. Perhaps you think it's entirely reasonable for higher earners to pay a much higher percentage of their income in taxes, and you believe those taxes should be paid in the present rather than deferred until later. I think it's reasonable to argue that this rule was primarily instituted for different reasons. The primary reason the government would want to tax catch-up contributions as after-tax payments is to increase the amount of revenue the government gets in the present rather than the future, since those contributions are being made by higher earners who can afford to pay more in taxes. By allowing those contributions to be made with pre-tax dollars, the government was essentially deferring revenue to the future, when the contributor would be likely to be in a lower tax bracket and therefore pay less in taxes on that income. By requiring those contributions to be made with after-tax dollars, the government gets to keep that money in the present, when it's needed most, instead of having to wait for it. It's entirely possible, perhaps likely, that the government's motivation for this rule change had very little to do with encouraging retirement savings and everything to do with its need for revenue in the present economy. Milton Friedman would have predicted this sort of thing. He spent much of his professional life arguing that the government is primarily motivated to enact policies which give it the most immediate revenue, rather than long-term stability, and that governments are much more likely to prioritize short-term revenue gains over long-term ones, simply because of the ability to do so. He argued that there would always be an ideological bias towards taxing the wealthy, since they're much more likely to have their income visible to the government, and much more likely to be able to pay those taxes without consequence. It's true that most people who use a 401k plan would have much rather deferred that taxation on their incomes, but it's also true that few of them even realized that their plan's rules had quietly changed and that they were no longer able to do so. It's easy to forget that these sorts of rules rarely come from anywhere other than governments. The rules which govern your retirement accounts are always subject to the whims of Congress, who enact laws which change the rules often without notice or explanation, and always with consequences far more severe than most people realize. It was especially difficult for people to realize in 2008, when the stock market dropped by nearly 40% in the span of just a few months, and nearly everyone lost large amounts of money on their retirement accounts. But few actually knew what to do about it. The lesson that people tend to forget in times of crisis is that it's necessary to continue to contribute to your retirement accounts, despite the losses you're taking in the present. The same goes for any number of financial rules and regulations that change, sometimes without notice, sometimes with it. Your retirement account is always being managed by someone else, someone who may or may not be watching your contributions as closely as you'd like them to be. It's important to keep in mind that those managing your accounts aren't doing it for your benefit, but for the benefit of the system they serve, which is why it's important to understand exactly what's going on with those accounts, instead of pretending that the money you contribute will always behave the way you think it should. People are much happier to contribute to a mutual fund when they believe they've already received a steady return on their investment, even if they haven't technically earned it yet. What do you do now? Well, first of all, you should probably determine whether or not you fall within the parameters of the new law. If you're over 50 and you made more than $150,000 this year, then I'm afraid you're going to have some fairly unpleasant news waiting for you when you look at your first paycheck of the year. You should also contact your plan administrator and ask whether or not your catch-up contribution election has been changed to a Roth contribution, as it should be, according to the new law. Secondly, you should take that into account when you file your taxes this year. If your catch-up contributions have been taxed as ordinary income this year, then your take-home pay is likely to be a bit lower than you'd been expecting this year, and there's not much you can do about that other than plan your finances accordingly. If you don't fall into the parameters of the new law, you're probably wondering what the big deal is. Well, there isn't one really. You're probably going to continue making contributions to your 401k account in much the same way you always have, unless the new law changes something else important to you. The new law, as it stands, only affects people who are over 50 and people who make large amounts of money. Unless, of course, you're wondering if the $150,000 threshold is likely to rise with inflation, as it almost certainly will, and you realize that next year, you're likely to fall into the new parameters of the law without even realizing it. It's an unpleasant realization to have, but it's a fairly common one in the world of personal finance. There's always going to be another catch, another rule change, another regulation, and it's always going to be fairly unpleasant to realize. The best thing to do is to be prepared for it, rather than surprised by it when it does come around. You'll be surprised by it eventually. Either way, you just got your first paycheck of the year. The amount was a bit different than you'd been expecting, but you didn't think much of it. You should have. One thing most people seem to forget is that 401k accounts are always being monitored by someone else, someone who cares much less about your personal financial security than they claim to. It's always important to remember that your employer is likely to change the rules without notice or warning, especially when it comes to tax-deferred accounts like traditional 401ks. This is why it's always a good idea to check what's going on with your retirement accounts from time to time, especially when you suspect something strange is happening. One thing you should always do is to check your eligibility and contribution limits to ensure that your contributions aren't suddenly going to be taxed as ordinary income or withheld from your paycheck entirely due to some rule change your employer enacted. It's much easier to deal with the unpleasant surprise of a smaller paycheck than it is with the prospect of paying taxes on a much larger one, especially when you've been expecting the former and not the latter. Another thing you should always do is to consider the possibility that rules and regulations may change without your knowledge or consent, especially in your retirement accounts. It's much safer to assume that the rules may change and plan your finances around that possibility, rather than assuming they won't change and getting blindsided when they inevitably do. I've always found it interesting, but nevertheless true, that people tend to plan their finances according to the best-case scenario possible, assuming little to no risk, and acting as if the rules rarely change, but it's an important mistake to correct. Especially when it comes to matters like this, I think you might be surprised to learn that people rarely change their retirement contributions, assuming they'll continue to behave in roughly the same way they always have. Most people I know tend to save some portion of their paycheck automatically, every year, without really thinking about it. People assume incorrectly that their retirement accounts are always going to remain as they are, with little to no change in their contributions. It's a comforting thought to know that you have some money set aside for the future, but it's an equally dangerous assumption to make. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, behavioral economists, have studied the way people make financial decisions and how a lot of that decision-making relies on inertia. People tend to save more money when they're given an option to do so automatically, without really thinking about it, rather than having to actively make the decision to save. It's much easier to save money if you don't have to think about it, and that's why many people use direct deposit to have a certain percentage of their paycheck automatically deposited into their retirement accounts. People aren't likely to take that action if they don't have to, which is why it's much more effective to let them save automatically rather than making them think about it. That's really the point of a default option in an automatic savings plan. It removes the decision-making process almost entirely, requiring little to no conscious decision to save money. That's why it's such a dangerous assumption to make about the rules of your 401k plan, that they'll almost always behave in a way you prefer, and that you don't need to think much about what's happening with them. You don't have to think about them much, but it doesn't mean they should change without your knowledge or consent, especially when they do so without your awareness at all. That's why it's a good idea to think about the possibility of change whenever you're dealing with a complicated financial system like your retirement accounts. You never know when something strange is going to happen that you weren't expecting, and it's always better to be prepared for those eventualities rather than blindsided by them. Most people, if they find out about the changes to the 401k law, will find out about it in one of two ways: either when they look at their paycheck and see that it's a little smaller than they were expecting and decide to do nothing about it, or when they go to file their taxes for the year and they find out, most unpleasantly, that they're being taxed on far more income than they expected to be taxed this year. In neither of these cases is there much they can do about it, besides make adjustments for next year and be prepared for potentially unpleasant surprises in the future. It's much better to know about something like this in advance, rather than be surprised by it at a later time, when you're much less prepared to deal with it. It's hard to believe, but the 2008 financial crisis was much more difficult for people to deal with, because the changes to their retirement accounts were much more obvious, much more visible. Those who had invested in mutual funds saw their money disappear almost overnight, and the amount of money they lost was much harder to ignore. It was much easier to accept the reality of a smaller paycheck, or even an unpleasant surprise when filing taxes later on in the year. It's a strange and unpleasant situation to be in, where you're much more surprised by one change than you are by another, when the latter change should have been much more difficult to accept. There's always going to be some sort of change like that, whether it comes in the form of a smaller paycheck or a larger tax bill. It's usually difficult to deal with in hindsight, when you weren't prepared for it at all. There's always going to be another unpleasant surprise waiting for you sometime in the future, but it's much better to be prepared for it, rather than be blindsided by it when you least expect it. People often forget to take notice of things that seem small and insignificant until they become large and overwhelming, and it's important to avoid that sort of behavior when it comes to financial planning. Benjamin Graham, famed investor and economist, has often argued that the most dangerous financial mistakes tend to occur when investors don't pay close enough attention to the details. He believed that most people tend to make the most expensive mistakes when they fail to pay attention to the fine print, which is why he often warned against taking risks when you're unfamiliar with the fundamentals of investing. The rule about catch-up contributions embedded in a law about retirement accounts passed years ago is a perfect example of that sort of fine print and a prime example of how dangerous it can be to overlook seemingly unimportant details. People tend to forget that their retirement accounts are always being manipulated in small ways by people who will rarely, if ever, take the time to inform them of those changes. The rules about these accounts are always shifting, sometimes without notice or warning, and it's always a good idea to be aware of those rules and how they apply to you. Someone has to make those rules and enforce them, and it's much easier for them to change the rules without notice or warning, especially when it comes to tax-deferred accounts, since few people tend to pay much attention to them in the first place, and those who do often don't realize how much they're being changed. People tend to save some portion of their income automatically every year without really thinking about it, and it's much easier for someone else to manipulate those automatic contributions than it is for them to manipulate conscious decisions. We assume reasonably that the rules of our 401k accounts are rarely going to change without notice or warning, but those assumptions don't tend to hold up in the face of reality. You just got your first paycheck of the year. The amount was a little different than you'd been expecting, but you didn't really think much of it. You should have.